At the peak of his power, billionaire Ethan Caldwell vanishes from the spotlight after a tragic car accident leaves him paralyzed. Or so the world believes. Hidden away in a mansion far from Wall Street, Ethan watches, not through security cameras, but from behind a mask of silence. He's not healing. He's hunting for the truth. Who still stands by him when there's no power to gain? Who's plotting behind closed doors? And why does one quiet nurse with no interest in his fortune start breaking through the armor he's built for years? This isn't a story about money. It's about betrayal, dignity, and the quiet redemption of a man who thought he had nothing left to learn. Stay with us. The truth begins now. Ethan Caldwell's breath came out in shallow bursts that fogged against the inside of his mask before the frost bit through and reached his lips. He lay perfectly still under the thin layer of snow, body positioned exactly as planned, arms twisted just enough to look unnatural. The crash had been orchestrated with obscene precision. The mangled car angled against the guardrail, a dented hood smeared with stage blood that had cost more than a new sedan. The plan was working, sirens in the distance, flashing red, the illusion of tragedy unfolding as the world prepared to mourn a man who wasn't dead. For a moment, lying there in the cold, Ethan wondered what kind of person fakes his own paralysis. The question should have disgusted him. Instead, it steadied him. This was control. This was data. He would finally see who was loyal and who had been waiting for the fall. The paramedics' voices were muffled through layers of calculation. They didn't know they were part of a script. Ethan had hired the best, a doctor, an actor, a few carefully compensated officials to manage the transfer paperwork. One false movement, one twitch, and the whole illusion would collapse. "No response, vitals steady," someone said, and a needle slid into his arm. As the sedative pulled him into blackness, he thought of Victoria, her measured smile, her fingertips tapping against glass when she lied. He imagined her first call after hearing the news. Not grief, not love, but calculation. He wanted to hear it in her voice, wanted confirmation that his instincts had been right all along. That was the irony of power. When you have it all, the only thing you can't buy is honesty. He woke hours later in a sterile suite of his Connecticut mansion, the same house that had once hosted senators and CEOs, now converted into a private hospital wing. A small team buzzed quietly around him, nurses, aides, all vetted, all temporary. His head doctor, a man named Carrington, adjusted the monitors and nodded approvingly at the readings. "You're stable, Mr. Caldwell," he said softly, though Ethan's eyes were closed. They had rehearsed that line. Stable meant believable. Stable meant the world would keep believing he was broken. In a room adjacent, someone clicked through a series of news broadcasts. Ethan heard his own name, repeated like a headline, echoing inside a tomb. Tragic accident. Severe spinal trauma. Prognosis uncertain. It was perfect. He could almost smile. By evening, Victoria arrived. The heels announced her before the perfume did. Ethan kept his eyelids heavy, heartbeat controlled, as she approached the bed. "You're still the same," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hand touched his arm, only long enough for the cameras outside to catch it. When she left the room, Ethan opened his eyes to the ceiling. The performance was flawless, hers and his. He had spent decades turning emotion into leverage, and she had learned from the best. Somewhere in another part of the mansion, his assistant updated a hidden feed. Stock reactions, board messages, investors speculating about succession. The world moved quickly when it smelled weakness. Ethan would move faster. That night, when the staff had gone quiet, he tested the paralysis. To remain convincing, he couldn't afford even a tremor where someone might see. But alone, he flexed his fingers under the sheet. The sensation came sharp and immediate. He was whole. The deception felt heavier than any injury could have. For the first time since he conceived the plan, doubt pricked through the armor. What if pretending to be powerless changed him in ways he couldn't reverse? He dismissed the thought. Power was a language he spoke fluently. He would never forget it. Yet the echo of the question stayed, a faint pulse beneath the practiced stillness. The next morning, the snow outside had melted into grey slush, but headlines hadn't cooled. Ethan Caldwell, financial visionary, paralyzed after near-fatal crash. Condolences poured in from those who'd once envied him. Inside the mansion, Ethan lay motionless as doctor. Carrington made the official call to transfer him permanently to private care. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Yet behind his closed eyes, Ethan knew this experiment wasn't just about uncovering betrayal. It was about control, about owning every narrative, even when bound to a bed. He didn't realize, not yet, that in testing others' hearts, he'd soon expose the emptiness of his own. The world outside believed he had fallen, and for the first time in his life, that part was true. Ruth Harper arrived precisely at 7 a.m. without ceremony or the need for introduction. She had seen many patients over her 2 decades in nursing, men locked inside broken bodies, women clinging to fading breaths. But there was something about Ethan Caldwell that unsettled her even in stillness. She had read the headlines, seen the broadcasts, heard the whispers about the fall of Wall Street's most elusive giant. But lying there, he didn't resemble a broken man. He resembled a closed vault. His eyes, though half-lidded, followed every movement she made with a sharpness that didn't align with trauma. Ruth didn't say much. She never did on the first day. People filled silences with all the wrong things, and in her experience, stillness revealed more than small talk ever could. She adjusted his IV line, checked his monitors, made notes with quiet efficiency. When she spoke, her tone was even and without pity. "I'll be here from 7 to 7. If anything feels wrong, I'll know before you do." Ethan didn't blink, didn't flinch, but Ruth noticed the slight shift in his breathing. Not panic, curiosity. By the 3rd day, Ruth had settled into the rhythm of the mansion-turned-hospital. The staff treated Ethan like a relic, polished, admired, and never truly touched. Ruth, however, treated him like a man with blood still running through his veins. She fed him herself when the aides delayed, wiped his forehead without waiting for permission, and occasionally hummed a tune under her breath. Never the same twice. Ethan never spoke, of course. But Ruth caught his gaze at unexpected moments. When she laughed on a phone call with her sister, when she sat beside the bed and read from a paperback novel as if he were listening. It wasn't the usual reaction of a patient clinging to comfort. It was sharper, closer to suspicion or fascination. Ruth didn't mind. She had cared for addicts, stroke victims, veterans who hadn't spoken in years. She knew how to exist around pain that had no name. What mattered was presence, consistency. And if Ethan Caldwell thought he could intimidate her with silence, he had another thing coming. Silence was her first language. Ethan had expected obedience, professionalism, yes, but also the subtle, desperate hunger that people around him always seemed to carry, even when masked behind politeness. Ruth carried no such hunger. She didn't ask about his money, his company, or the rumors surrounding the accident. She didn't try to impress. In fact, she seemed almost unaware of the legend he'd become. That made her dangerous in a way that intrigued him. She moved through the house like she belonged nowhere, yet lacked fear of any room. One afternoon, as she adjusted his pillows, he felt her pause. Just a breath. Her hand didn't tremble, but her voice dropped an octave. "You ever think about how many people pretend to love you when you can't move?" It was rhetorical, or maybe it wasn't. But she didn't wait for an answer. She simply resumed her task and left him with the weight of her question. And that weight pressed down heavier than any lie he was currently carrying. Late that week, Victoria made her second appearance since the transfer. Ruth had been warned about her, The staff moved differently when Victoria entered. Straighter backs, forced smiles. Ruth didn't change. She greeted her with a nod, offered a basic update on vitals, and returned to checking Ethan's catheter line. Victoria barely acknowledged her. "Does he even respond to touch?" she asked. Eyes on the bed, but voice pointed at the ceiling. Ruth replied with clinical calm. "He reacts to what matters." Victoria didn't like that. She muttered something under her breath about hiring nurses from discount registries and walked out with a click of her heels that was meant to sting. It didn't. Ruth wasn't new to women like Victoria, too elegant to sweat, too brittle to bend. But what she did notice was the change in Ethan's expression. A flicker, 1 second, no more. Disgust, embarrassment, maybe something colder. Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it came. But Ruth caught it. She always did. By the end of the first week, Ruth began writing short notes in a small leather-bound book she kept in her pocket, not for legal documentation, though that was part of it, but for observations, things she couldn't explain on paper but didn't want to lose. Eyes follow sound, not always movement. Jaw tightens during news coverage of wife. Breath shifts when jazz plays. She didn't tell anyone about the notebook. It wasn't for them. It was her way of mapping the disconnect between what Ethan Caldwell presented to the world and what his body betrayed when he thought no one was watching. She didn't need proof that something was off. She felt it, the way nurses do when they've spent enough time around men who refuse to admit what's really broken. Ethan wasn't a paralyzed man trying to survive. He was a man pretending to be something else entirely. But Ruth didn't say anything. Not yet, she knew how to wait. And yet, despite everything, the wealth, the lies, the walls he'd built, Ethan found himself unable to categorize Ruth. She didn't fit into the roles he'd scripted for people: sycophant, threat, tool, liability. She was just there, steady, unimpressed. She treated his body with care but not reverence, spoke without pretense, moved without trying to be invisible. And when she touched his hand to check circulation, he didn't flinch, but something in him recoiled, not from her, but from the unfamiliar feeling that crept in: exposure, vulnerability. Ruth never asked for his story, never pressed for gratitude, but every day she returned just the same. And somehow, that unshakable consistency, that refusal to see him as anything other than a patient worth caring for, began to unnerve him more than any threat he'd ever faced. Because for the first time in years, someone was looking at him and not seeing money, legacy, or myth, just a man, and Ethan Caldwell didn't know what to do with that. Victoria Caldwell didn't shed a tear. She entered the estate dressed in black, not mourning black, but designer restraint, a controlled symbol for the cameras she knew would be watching from a distance. The staff had been instructed not to comment, not to ask questions, and certainly not to comfort her. But none had dared to approach anyway. Her presence commanded space without ever raising her voice. She greeted the chief physician with a handshake, firm enough to be businesslike, but brief enough to signal disinterest. "Let's be clear," she said, flipping through a summarized medical chart. "I want real-time updates and no press leaks. If anything changes, real changes, I get the call first." When she finally walked into Ethan's room, her expression didn't falter. She looked at her husband for no more than 10 seconds before offering a dry, rehearsed sigh. "You've always been dramatic," she murmured under her breath. Her hand landed briefly on his shoulder, the touch cool and performative. It lingered just long enough to register with any observers, then vanished. She adjusted the collar of his blanket as if fixing a mannequin's tie, not a man she'd once vowed to love. Over the following days, her visits were rare and increasingly brief. Ruth noted the pattern, though she never commented. Victoria appeared mid-morning or near dusk, her timing always coinciding with meetings or phone calls. She never stayed more than 20 minutes, and her conversations, when held at Ethan's bedside, were oddly impersonal. Business updates, passive-aggressive reminders of how many people were depending on his recovery, and subtle nudges about legal delegation. "The board's nervous," she told him once, tracing the edge of his IV pole with her fingernail. "They keep asking if you named someone interim. Should I tell them it's me?" Ethan remained still, his face impassive, but Ruth saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled beneath the sheet a fraction tighter. After each visit, Victoria would leave without a glance at the staff. Not a thank you, not a nod. Just a click of heels and the faint scent of something expensive, fading like a ghost that never wanted to be seen. Ruth had grown used to all kinds of families, grieving, angry, devastated, or desperate for closure. But Victoria Caldwell was something else. Cold wasn't the right word. Cold could be broken with warmth. Victoria was calibrated. Everything she did seemed designed for a specific result, a reaction, a record, a response she could manipulate. But Ethan didn't give her that. He gave her nothing. And perhaps that's why she came less and less. One evening, after a particularly clipped visit where Victoria had scrolled through her phone while listing off financial updates, Ruth lingered by the door as the wife departed. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," she said plainly. Victoria stopped, turning her head just enough. "He's my husband," she replied with a flat smile. "I do what's required." Then she left, not waiting for a reply. Ruth returned to the room and found Ethan's eyes slightly open, staring at the ceiling. No tears, no blink, but something in his expression had shifted, more bitter than broken. Soon the gaps between Victoria's visits stretched longer. Her reasons were always the same: late-night meetings, charity events, dinner with stakeholders. But Ruth began to overhear things. Quiet calls behind closed doors, laughter that didn't match grief, and a name: Logan. It came up once during a call Victoria took outside the room, thinking no one could hear. "He's barely breathing, Logan. The timing couldn't be better." Ruth pretended not to notice. But she began writing more in her notebook, short, clipped sentences that captured the hollowness in Victoria's tone, the calculation behind every movement. Ethan, always alert in his silence, watched Ruth more closely. He wasn't just listening to his wife's voice anymore. He was watching how Ruth reacted to it. There was something in her posture, the way her eyes refused to look away, that told him she knew more than she let on. But unlike everyone else, she didn't confront or confide. She simply stayed. It was during one of those long stretches of absence that Ruth, while adjusting his blanket, murmured, "Some people leave before they walk away." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation, but it hung in the air with weight. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't, not yet. But something inside him tightened. That sentence cut deeper than any headline or betrayal. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps because Ruth didn't say it with pity or judgment. Just truth. And truth, when unadorned, had a way of slicing through even the thickest walls. The next day, Victoria didn't show up at all, nor the day after. And for the first time since the accident, Ethan felt the absence like a void, sharp, personal, and entirely unexpected. It was strange to admit, even to himself, that he had anticipated something more from her. Not love, that had long since eroded beneath ambition and convenience, but presence, acknowledgement, something human. Instead, he found himself lying in a bed, surrounded by staff paid to serve and a nurse who refused to flatter. The silence grew louder. Not the silence of performance, but of abandonment. For all his wealth, all his foresight, all his manipulation, Ethan Caldwell was alone. And for the first time since this twisted game began, the loneliness wasn't strategic, it wasn't crafted, it was real, and it burned in a way he hadn't prepared for. Not in his muscles or his bones, but somewhere deeper, somewhere even money couldn't reach. Ruth entered the room without announcing herself, the way she always did. But this time, she carried a cup in her hand, not a medication tray, not a chart, just a simple ceramic mug filled with tea. She placed it gently on the nightstand beside Ethan's bed, the steam curling upward like breath in winter. "My grandmother used to say, 'Hot tea heals long silences,'" she said, almost to herself. Her voice wasn't soft but grounded, as if her words came from something rooted far deeper than routine. Ethan lay motionless, eyes open, fixed on the ceiling as he always did when she spoke, but this time his eyes shifted. Barely. Just enough. Ruth didn't notice, or pretended not to. She adjusted the edge of his blanket and sat beside the bed for a moment longer than usual, not in a hurry to leave. That tea wasn't protocol, it wasn't necessary, it was a choice, a gesture. And Ethan, for all his cold calculation, felt something stir, a question he hadn't asked himself in a long time. When was the last time someone brought him something without expecting anything in return? Unbeknownst to Ruth, the room was always recording. A small, concealed device in the bookshelf archived every word, every sound. Originally installed to catch whispers from Victoria or Logan, or any visitor foolish enough to scheme within earshot, the device had begun to fill with something else entirely. Fragments of Ruth's monologues, her humming, her quiet check-ins that weren't required by her job. Ethan hadn't planned to analyze those recordings. At first, he ignored them, but one night, unable to sleep, he listened. "Tea helps with the kind of silence that sinks into your bones," Ruth had said on day 3. Not the awkward kind, the kind that waits for someone brave enough to fill it. Ethan replayed that line 3 times. He didn't know why. There was nothing strategic about it, no usable intel. And yet, it stuck. She wasn't speaking to him as a patient. She wasn't speaking to him as a billionaire. She was speaking to a silence that no one else had noticed inside him. And somehow, her words had found their way through. That afternoon, when Ruth returned to check his vitals, Ethan did something he hadn't done since the accident. He blinked with intention. Not random movement, not involuntary spasm. He blinked to signal. Ruth paused, looking at him. "Do you need something?" she asked, uncertain. He didn't move again. Not yet, but the moment lingered between them like a held breath. Ruth didn't press. She simply nodded, understanding without needing confirmation. "I'll bring music next time," she said. "Something good, real." And she did. Hours later, she returned with a dusty vinyl she had kept in her car. A copy of Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Cole Porter Songbook, worn at the edges, but perfect in spirit. She placed the record on a portable turntable, lowered the needle, and sat near the window without saying a word. The first notes filled the room with a warmth that even his fortune couldn't replicate. The music played like memory. Hers, his, maybe both. Ruth didn't look at him as it played. She knew better. She simply let Ella do the talking. "Every time we say goodbye, I die a little." The lyrics weren't aimed at anyone, yet they fell into the cracks Ethan hadn't sealed. He closed his eyes slowly, not because of pain, not for sleep, but for something else. Not rest, not escape, reflection maybe. For the first time since he'd orchestrated this entire charade, since the accident, the lies, the cameras, he let go of the performance, if only internally. There was no one to fool at that moment. Just a man lying still, listening to a song that sounded like a life he'd never lived. The luxury wasn't the music. It was the simplicity of being invisible without being erased. Ruth remained seated until the side B of the record ran out. She didn't ask questions, didn't comment on the fact that Ethan's hands had flexed ever so slightly beneath the covers. She noticed, of course. Ruth noticed everything, but she understood the value of small truths. Some things needed silence to survive. Some recognitions weren't meant to be said aloud, not yet. When she rose to leave, she adjusted the cup of tea, now lukewarm, on the table and glanced once toward him. "Music's good for grief," she said. "Even when you're grieving things you never had." Then she left, taking nothing with her, not even a glance back. Ethan opened his eyes long after the door clicked shut. The room felt unchanged, but everything inside him had moved, just slightly, like ice breaking beneath the surface. He had spent years mastering power through control of people, of markets, of perception. But he hadn't prepared for this kind of disarmament. Ruth hadn't tried to unravel him. She hadn't asked anything of him. And somehow, that made her presence more dangerous than any boardroom rival. She saw the silence in him and didn't run from it. Instead, she shared her own. He could have dismissed her words, filed them away like background noise, but he didn't. He absorbed them, because deep down, no matter how composed the lie, some truths still find their way in. And that afternoon, as Ella sang and the world turned elsewhere, Ethan Caldwell closed his eyes, not for pain, not for sleep, but for longing, for something he never had. It was late when Ethan first heard it, Victoria's voice, low and composed, drifting through the barely cracked office door. She didn't know he was close enough to listen. She likely assumed he was asleep, tucked away in his private wing like a relic collecting dust. But Ethan was awake, every sense heightened not by fear, but by the nagging intuition that something would eventually surface. And it did. "He's done," Victoria said plainly. "He can't stop us now. Let's finalize the deal with the Europeans." Logan's voice was muffled, but his agreement was clear, punctuated with a half-laugh that sounded too relaxed for the magnitude of betrayal. Ethan remained still, his body in the mechanical stillness he had rehearsed endlessly. But inside, the words didn't echo. They thudded, settled, stayed. It wasn't just the deal that stung. It wasn't even the collusion. It was the utter lack of hesitation in her tone. No guilt, no pause, just efficiency. As if she were closing the final page of a business transaction rather than severing the last thread of something human between them. Ruth entered moments later, unaware of what he'd just heard. She walked in with the same quiet confidence she always carried, holding the evening dosage, eyes on the routine, not the wreckage. "Time for your meds," she said gently, checking the IV line, glancing once at the monitors. Ethan watched her with a heaviness in his stare that wasn't from the medication. She didn't notice immediately, but when she turned to press the plunger on the syringe, she caught it, the way his eyes locked onto her, searching for something. "You okay?" she asked without expecting an answer. But the silence felt different this time. Tense, weighted. He blinked, slow, deliberate. She paused. "You want music tonight?" He didn't respond, and something about the blankness unnerved her in a way it never had before. She straightened, tucked the blanket at his side, and hesitated before leaving. "I'll come back in a bit," she said. But he was already gone in thought, miles away in the space where betrayal echoes louder than any voice. The truth was, Ethan hadn't expected loyalty from Victoria, not anymore. That illusion had shattered long before the accident. But what he hadn't anticipated was the cold efficiency in her betrayal. It wasn't born of resentment or wounded pride. It was just business. That was what hollowed him out more than anything else. She hadn't even tried to mask it with sentimentality. There was no betrayal cloaked in passion, no confession laced with tears, just a transaction, and he was the liability being written off. As he lay in that bed, unable to speak, pretending to be paralyzed to expose betrayal, he realized the irony. She hadn't even tried to hide it, which meant she no longer saw him as anything worth deceiving. That realization was worse than rage. It didn't ignite vengeance. It numbed him. For the first time in his calculated little game, he didn't feel in control. He felt obsolete. And that led him to Ruth, not because she had done anything wrong, but because in that moment of disillusionment, everyone became suspect. The mind of a man like Ethan didn't know how to compartmentalize. He only knew systems, patterns, liabilities, risk management. Victoria had crossed the line he expected her to, But what if Ruth, too, was just a more patient version of the same thing? What if her gentle routines and honest eyes were merely a strategy, a long con for a piece of the future estate? She was the only person he hadn't been able to read completely. And now, after hearing Victoria's voice cut so cleanly through years of shared life, he couldn't help but wonder if Ruth's silence wasn't virtue, but calculation. He hated the thought. But more than that, he hated how easily it came to him. He was poisoned by suspicion, and he knew it. But knowing didn't unpoison the wound. Ruth returned about an hour later, holding the record player. "Ella again?" she asked softly. He didn't blink. She noticed the change, not in his expression, but in the way the room felt heavier around him. She placed the turntable on the table and hovered for a moment, uncertain. "You want quiet tonight?" Again, no response. She nodded to herself, lips pressed into a thin line, and turned to leave. "Okay, we'll skip it." Her voice had the smallest edge of hurt, barely there, but detectable to someone who had learned to listen for things not said. As she left, Ethan turned his gaze to the ceiling. He had built an empire by trusting data over people. And now, lying in the stillness of his own making, he couldn't trust the only person who hadn't asked him for anything, not because she'd given him reason, but because betrayal, once heard, doesn't echo alone. It multiplies. Lying there alone once more, Ethan didn't review recordings or plan his next move. He didn't even think about Logan or the European deal or what legal mechanisms he could use to strike back. Instead, he kept hearing Victoria's voice, sharp as glass, declaring his irrelevance. That more than the lie of paralysis paralyzed him, not physically but at the core of who he was. The betrayal didn't surprise him. What broke him was the emptiness it left behind. He didn't feel fury. He didn't feel heartbreak. He felt pity. For Victoria, for himself, maybe even for Ruth, if she was innocent and stuck in this spider's web. And beneath all of that, deeper than he was willing to admit, was fear. Fear that he was wrong about everything. Fear that no one had ever loved him at all. Fear that he was now just a man in a bed, fading behind the very silence he had created to expose others. Victoria's voice rang sharp the moment she stepped into the room, but it wasn't the pitch that made Ruth freeze. It was the cold certainty behind every word. "There's been a discrepancy in the petty cash records," she said, arms crossed, lips pursed in that way that always preceded accusation. "Funny how it started right after you began working here." Ruth, holding the morning medications, didn't flinch. She simply placed the tray down, turned slowly to face Victoria, and said nothing. "You're clever," Victoria continued, circling the bed like a predator toying with prey. "Quiet. Invisible. That's how people get away with things, isn't it? We trust them because they fade into the background, but I don't." Her eyes flicked to Ethan. He wouldn't want someone irresponsible around him, or dishonest. She let the words hang, a carefully poisoned cloud. Ethan remained motionless, eyes steady. Ruth turned her gaze toward him, searching his face for any sign, any flicker of defense. But there was only stillness. The accusation was cruel, but not just because of the lie. It was the way Victoria delivered it, so smoothly, like she'd practiced the speech. Ruth had been in the room just a moment before to help Ethan with a blanket adjustment. Nothing unusual, nothing worthy of suspicion. And now she was standing accused of theft with no warning, no defense, and worst of all, no reaction from the man she had spent weeks caring for. "If something is missing," Ruth said, her voice controlled but shaking at the edges, "then check the books. You'll see my name on none of it." Victoria smirked. "Thieves don't leave trails, but they always get comfortable eventually. That's when they slip." Ruth bit her cheek, hard. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. She looked at Ethan again, willing him to do something, anything. A twitch of the hand, a blink, a denial. But still, nothing. The silence from him screamed louder than Victoria's venom, and Ruth realized in that moment that silence could betray just as effectively as a lie. After Victoria left the room with a final threat, "I'll be speaking to legal about your removal," Ruth remained for a moment, gathering herself. She wasn't a stranger to false assumptions. She'd been called a lot of things in her life. But being called a thief in this house by that woman, in front of this man she'd trusted despite knowing better, that cut deeper. Her chest rose with an inhale meant to ground her, but it only made her feel heavier. Finally, she turned to Ethan. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no warmth in them. "The truth," she said, steady but low, "always finds a way." She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't wait for a gesture. She picked up her tray and walked out. The door closed gently behind her, but to Ethan it may as well have slammed. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was jagged, shame-ridden, inescapable. Ethan stared at the ceiling, his breathing shallow, his limbs motionless, not because they had to be, but because he no longer knew what motion could undo what had just happened. He had watched it unfold, knowing Ruth was innocent, knowing Victoria was lying, and he had done nothing. His silence was meant to be strategic, the stillness of a man gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. But now it felt like cowardice. Ruth had come into his life as the only person unbought, unafraid. She'd brought tea when no one else even asked if he was thirsty. She'd watched him without reverence, cared for him without condition, and he had let her be humiliated. That realization landed with a thud in his chest. Not rage, not self-pity, just the sickening awareness that the mask he wore wasn't just for others. It had hidden him from himself. Beneath the covers, something shifted. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but Ethan's right hand, hidden from sight, tightened into a fist. The act wasn't for show. No one saw it. It was private, instinctive, and it said what he couldn't yet say aloud. Enough. Enough of the performance, the surveillance, the paralysis that was no longer physical. His game had crossed a line, and in doing so had wounded someone who never played to begin with. Ruth's dignity, her integrity, her restraint, they were not tools in his experiment. And now they were collateral damage in a war he had started but no longer controlled. That night he didn't sleep. He played back every recording, not of Victoria, but of Ruth. Her words, her silences, her unspoken disappointments. Each one chipped away at the armor he'd built over years of mistrust, and with each playback, the end of the lie came closer. By morning, his decision was clear, not as a tactic, not as a maneuver, but as a consequence. The cost of remaining in hiding had become too great. Not because he feared losing the company, not because he feared Victoria or Logan, but because somewhere in the space between a cup of tea and a whispered goodbye, Ruth Harper had become the only honest thing left in his life, and he had let her bleed for it. Lying in bed, eyes wide open, he didn't just feel like a man pretending to be broken. He felt like a man who finally realized he already was, and the only way back to the truth was through it. The conference hall of Caldwell Equity in Manhattan was packed. Executives, shareholders, media personnel, all gathered under the allure of a historic announcement. Victoria Caldwell stood center stage, polished as ever, her voice ringing with manufactured optimism as she welcomed a new chapter in the company's legacy. Behind her, a massive screen displayed the sleek new logo she had personally approved, flanked by buzzwords like agility, vision, global expansion. Logan Price loomed behind the curtains, watching her with smug satisfaction, arms crossed, his expression calm, almost bored, like a man who had already won. The press clicked photos. Some guests applauded. But just as Victoria stepped forward to outline her proposal to restructure international assets, the main doors opened. Gasps rippled across the crowd. All eyes turned. There, walking slowly but unmistakably upright, was Ethan Caldwell. For months, the world had believed he was paralyzed, lost to an accident, silenced by trauma. Now, here he was, in a tailored suit, his posture rigid, every step deliberate, each footfall echoing not just through the hall, but through every carefully woven lie that had fed off his absence. A few attendees rose involuntarily. Others simply froze, eyes wide, unable to reconcile the man before them with the myth of his incapacitation. Victoria's face drained of color. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Logan's smile faded, his shoulders stiffened. Ruth Harper, watching from her modest apartment with a mug of tea in her hand, stared at the television in disbelief. The mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor, but she didn't move to clean it. Her breath caught. "Oh my God," she whispered, to no one. Ethan didn't speak, not at first. He stood in silence at the base of the stage, letting the moment linger, letting the weight of his presence settle like dust on glass. Then, with practiced calm, he raised one arm. Behind him, the large screen flickered. The slick logo vanished, replaced by a folder icon labeled Truth. It opened. One by one, the files began to play. Audio clips, each time-stamped, echoed through the speakers. Victoria mocking Ethan's condition, Logan negotiating under the table with European buyers, plans to divert funds and reallocate power. A video appeared, surveillance from inside the Caldwell estate, showing Victoria instructing staff to isolate Ethan from key decisions. Emails followed, messages laced with ambition and betrayal, confirming what many had suspected, but never dared say aloud. No narration was needed. The evidence spoke louder than any speech could. People began to murmur. Some rose to leave. Others simply stared at the stage as if watching a play collapse mid-scene. Victoria tried to interrupt, stepping toward the podium. This is out of context," she began, but her voice was lost in the noise. Ethan finally stepped up, standing beside her, not touching her, not even looking at her. He faced the audience and waited for the final recording to end, a voice memo from Victoria, laughing with Logan. "He's practically a corpse. By the time anyone realizes, I'll already be in charge." The audio cut off. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Ethan looked out at the crowd, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer justification. He didn't deliver a speech. He simply let them sit with the truth. That was the brilliance of it. He wasn't reclaiming his power. He was revealing how others had abused his silence. On the screen, the Caldwell Equity Board appeared via live video, their expressions grim. One of them, the chairman, spoke without delay. "Effective immediately, Victoria Caldwell is suspended pending internal investigation. Mr. Logan Price is also under review." A gasp, a shuffle of chairs. Victoria stepped back, her poise crumbling as she turned toward Logan. He avoided her eyes. "You knew he was watching," she hissed. Logan didn't respond. Cameras caught every angle. The once invincible image of the power couple imploded under the floodlights. The world had come expecting a coronation. What they witnessed was a reckoning. And Ethan, unmoved by the chaos around him, slowly turned his eyes toward the camera, knowing exactly where it was. Not for the press, for her. Back in her apartment, Ruth still hadn't moved. Her breath was shaky, her hand trembling as she leaned forward. Ethan's eyes on the screen looked past the board, past the traitors, and past the audience. They were looking for someone who wasn't in the room. Someone who had seen him when no one else was watching. Someone who brought tea instead of demands. Someone who reminded him of the man he might have been. He didn't mouth her name. He didn't need to. But when their eyes met through the camera lens, something in Ruth cracked open, not from sadness, but from recognition. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't said a word. But he didn't need to. Not anymore. Because the lie was dead. The masks had burned. And in that moment, his eyes said what his voice had failed to. "I see you." And I remember, that was enough. Weeks passed, but not quietly. After the public implosion at Caldwell Equity, headlines churned with speculation, lawsuits, and boardroom drama. Yet Ethan Caldwell didn't return to his empire. Not the way people expected. Instead, he re-emerged with something no one had seen coming: the Harper Foundation. The announcement was made via press release, unassuming, almost quiet, focusing on its mission: health and education for underserved communities across the country. The name struck a chord, though few knew the real story behind it. Harper, the nurse who had never asked for anything, the woman who had once said, "Truth finds a way." Ethan didn't offer interviews. He let the name speak for itself. But behind the scenes, he was rebuilding, not his company, not his brand, but himself. It began with an invitation. The gala dinner marking the foundation's official launch was scheduled for a Saturday evening, a black tie affair in Midtown. Invitations were hand-delivered. One of them found its way to a modest brownstone in Harlem. Ruth Harper read the card, simple and cream-colored, her name written in Ethan's own handwriting. Inside, a short note: "I would be honored by your presence." She didn't hesitate. She folded the card, slipped it into a drawer, and never replied. 2 days before the event, she mailed something back, a single handwritten line on the back of the invitation. "Truth also proves itself in time, no salutation, no signature, just those words." When Ethan received it, he didn't speak. He placed the note carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket, the way one might carry a verdict, not of guilt but of earned silence. The gala proceeded without her. Ethan stood at the podium, surrounded by philanthropists, activists, and a press that still didn't know what to make of his transformation. He didn't mention Victoria or Logan or the scandal that had unraveled in front of the world. Instead, he talked about roots. About growing up with everything except understanding. About watching people work harder than he ever had just to survive. He spoke about the importance of dignity, about being seen, not as a file or statistic, but as a whole person. Those who didn't know him whispered that the speech was surprisingly human. Those who didn't recognize the man at all. And perhaps that was the point. That night, Ethan didn't raise a glass to power. He raised it to clarity. But he left the stage with one thing still missing: her. In the days that followed, Ethan disappeared from headlines once again, but he reappeared somewhere else, on the ground. He visited clinics in Brooklyn, sat in classrooms in Newark, spoke to teenagers in Philadelphia who had never seen a CEO in their neighborhood unless they were in handcuffs or on campaign posters. He listened, not with analysts taking notes, not with PR cameras in the background, but with both feet on the floor and his phone turned off. For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell asked questions with no intention of turning the answers into leverage. He shook hands without sealing deals. He leaned in, not to manipulate, but to understand. And when people spoke, he didn't interrupt. He remembered Ruth's voice, steady and plain, saying, "Some people leave before they walk away." He had walked away, but he hadn't left. Meanwhile, Ruth watched from a distance. She saw the news, the photos, the interviews. She didn't comment, didn't send congratulations. But one morning, something arrived at her door. No postage, no return address. Just a thick envelope with her name written in a script she recognized instantly. Inside, a badge. On it, Ruth Harper, Director of Social Impact, Harper Foundation. Beneath that, handwritten in black ink, "I only stood because you taught me how to rise." No explanation, no plea. Just that. Ruth sat for a long time with the badge in her hand. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and her grip on the weight of all that had happened loosened, just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something like respect. And respect, for Ruth Harper, was never given lightly. She placed the badge on her kitchen table and stared at it, the silence around her not empty, but full of choices. She had never needed titles, never asked for recognition. But this wasn't about ego. It was about the fact that someone had finally seen her, not as a servant, not as background, but as a name worthy of a door. Not a room she entered for others, but one where she could lead. As she rose from her chair, the weight of the badge still warm in her palm, she didn't know what her next step would be. But she knew this: truth, when carried with dignity, doesn't knock. It waits. And now it had left the door open for her to walk through. It had been months since the gala, since the badge, since the quiet return of something like trust. The Harper Foundation had grown, not just in numbers or budget or influence, but in purpose. It had become a place where names were learned, not just recorded, where voices that once trembled were now amplified. And on that ordinary afternoon, in the Foundation's courtyard, Ruth Harper found herself standing quietly behind Ethan Caldwell, watching him from a short distance. He hadn't seen her yet. He was sitting on a bench, his back relaxed, his eyes following a little girl who knelt on the pavement, completely absorbed in her drawing. Ruth took a moment to observe. The girl was no older than 6, her braids falling forward as she leaned in, her hands stained with chalk. She was one of the orphans enrolled in the Foundation's residential program. Her face was serious, determined, as if what she was drawing mattered more than anything. Ruth finally stepped forward, her steps neither hesitant nor rushed. She sat beside Ethan without saying a word. He didn't turn to look at her, but he didn't move away either. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just watched the girl, who continued drawing with the kind of focus that only children possessed, completely in the moment, unaware of the history and the two people behind her. Ruth's hands rested in her lap. Ethan's were clasped together, elbows on his knees. The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It wasn't forced. It had become something else entirely: mutual understanding. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but without the stiffness of his former self. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, not as a man expecting redemption, but as one willing to accept the answer, whatever it might be. Ruth didn't respond right away. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't see the billionaire, the manipulator, the strategist who once used his own body as a test. She saw a man, just a man, and she knew that's all he could offer now. "You were a man hiding behind mirrors," she said. "Today, you're just a man. That's enough." Her words landed without fanfare. No dramatic swell of emotion, no cinematic pause, just truth, delivered plainly, as Ruth always had. Ethan exhaled slowly and closed his eyes. Not from pain, not from weariness, but from a kind of peace that had eluded him for far too long. He didn't try to thank her. He didn't try to explain himself again. The old Ethan would have. He would have layered apology with reasoning, tried to construct a version of himself that still resembled control. But that version had been stripped away. Ruth had done the stripping, not with accusations or confrontation, but with presence, with patience, and now with clarity. She hadn't just seen through him. She had waited until he could see through himself. That was the difference. That was the grace. The little girl finished her drawing and stood up. She looked back at them, holding the chalk in her hand. "It's us," she said simply. Ruth tilted her head, puzzled. The girl pointed at the image she had drawn. 3 figures, childlike in form, with bright-colored lines connecting their hands. "That's me," she explained, pointing to the smallest figure. "And that's you," she told Ruth, then looked at Ethan. "And that's him." Ruth blinked. Ethan leaned forward to get a better look. 3 hands, all holding, not perfectly drawn, not even proportional, but full of something real, belonging. Hope. Connection. "It's nice," Ruth said softly. The girl beamed. "I thought you looked like people who used to know each other," she said, then ran off toward another group of children without waiting for a response. Ruth felt the girl's small fingers wrap around her hand, just as the child dashed off, like an echo of the gesture she had just drawn. She hadn't meant to stay long that day. She'd come to check on a meeting, to drop off paperwork, maybe just to remind herself why she said yes to the badge in the first place. But this moment was not on any schedule. She looked at Ethan, still quiet, still with his eyes closed. She didn't let go of the girl's touch, even though the child was now out of sight. Ethan opened his eyes again and glanced down. His hand met Ruth's, not with force, not with hesitation, just presence. He placed his fingers gently over hers, and they stayed like that. 3 hands from 3 lives, each scarred, each searching, now simply resting together. No one spoke again. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't hollow. It held weight. It held the echo of all that had been said and unsaid between them for months. It was no longer about what had been broken, or even what had been repaired. It was about what was possible now. The last word hadn't come from Ethan or from Ruth. It had come from the child, chalk in hand, reminding them both that healing didn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it arrived without language, without warning. Just 3 hands, held in stillness, beneath a sky that neither judged nor praised. And in that silence, the sound of life starting over was louder than anything else, like a name freshly carved into stone, not to mourn, but to last. We're so grateful to have you here with us. Every story we share takes days, sometimes weeks, to craft with care, and we do it thinking of you, our community. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. That small gesture helps us keep bringing powerful and meaningful stories straight to your screen. Take a moment to explore the other stories we've told. They're all made with the same heart and dedication. And we'd truly love to hear from you. What touched you most about today's story? Leave us a comment. Your words mean more than you know. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.